Welcome everybody. This is today is the second of our seminar presentations, looking at different sectors, systems, transportation systems interacting with other systems, such as the housing systems that Betty Deacon talked about last week, and looking at decarbonization, the existential goal for all of us. By whatever date. Lou's going to talk about a couple dates. Lou Fulton, our speaker today. So our speaker today is Dr. Lou Fulton from our own ITS Davis. And Lou, I'm going to let you give like a quick introduction to who you are. I think there was some introduction in the first seminar about the different organizations, but maybe you can give just a very brief introduction to your career. Just to let other folks know where you're coming from and some different career paths as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lou Fulton.
Great. Okay. Thank you, John. Nice to be here. And even though I'm not there, I'm in Ottawa, and it sounds like you've gotten rain, which probably some of you are annoyed about. But boy, it sounds really good that Davis and California are getting rain. We're getting a lot of rain in Ottawa, but it's not a big deal here. It's pretty common. I'm here doing a Fulbright fellowship for a couple of months, and it's nice. It's nice to do that, but I do miss Davis, and I'm looking forward to getting back there in November. Yeah, I run a couple of things. I'm director of our STEPS program, and hopefully most of you know what that is, but it's a group of research groups, and we all work together on important topics, Plug-in Hybrid Electric Vehicle Center and the 3 Revs Future Mobility Center, China Center, Sustainable Freight Program, and the Energy Futures Program. And then I also directly lead that one, the Energy Futures Program. And today's talk is really an energy futures kind of talk, although it certainly draws on these other things too. And I guess I'll just get into it here. So I'm going to pop up my slides. And what I'm doing is reporting on a study we did over the past year. Well, it ended in April, so it's actually been out for 6 months. And get into some of the findings and implications and get people thinking and hopefully talking about it, and we can spend some time discussing it. Anne-Marie keeps telling me that I have 45 minutes, so I keep adding slides, and I'll probably end up going too long, but I'll try. Maybe she told me I had more than that. Anyway, I'll try to go about 45, 50 minutes and leave half an hour for discussion, but I guess people are able to put questions in the Q&A box, or at least the one that's online can do that, but let's get through this and then we can talk. So the title of the study and the title of my talk is Driving California's Emissions to Zero. And I'm going to actually start with a slide that is related to next week's talk, which you're going to have Jacob Teeter from the IEA. And I didn't have time to see if he might be on right now. He probably isn't, because I think it's fairly late in Paris. But except actually he's in the US, right? And he's going to be doing that talk with you. So I think he's already in the US. Anyway, he's going to speak next week about global efforts to drive CO2 from transportation down towards zero. And the IEA has published probably the definitive piece on this so far. IPCC has released their 6th assessment report, which so far they've released the first working group paper, which is always on the state of the science of climate change, and they won't get to publishing their mitigation AR6 report until the spring, which will no doubt have a lot of good insights on what to do to decarbonize sectors like transportation. But in the meantime, IEA has published this report, and I don't want to steal Jacob's thunder, but I just want to show you what they think it might take. And I realize this is a difficult thing to see, but I'll just read it to you. The orange ones are transportation. And among other things, they mention a 60% market share, sales share in the global light duty vehicle market need to be electric or zero emission by 2030. 50% of heavy truck sales would need to be electric in 2035, with at that point no new internal combustion engine car sales. So we're basically phasing out internal combustion engine car sales by 2035, and this is globally. And then the last one here is something that's a little beyond my talk today, but aviation fuel, which is 10% and rising of transportation fuel use worldwide. And they're saying at least 50% of it needs to be low carbon, probably low carbon biofuels, maybe e-fuel by 2040. And that's one of the hardest things. And I'll get into biofuels in this talk. And I think it's going to be very challenging. So anyway, he'll tell you a lot more about that next week from the global point of view. And right now I'll talk about this study that came out in April, as I mentioned. So we were tasked by the administration here in California to look at this question. They actually commissioned two studies, this one and one about reducing and eventually eliminating fossil fuel production in California, or at least petroleum production, I can't remember. But so we were looking at the demand side and trying to come up with strategies and pathways to get to zero or something close to zero. California, because of the governor's executive order, is committed to going to zero economy-wide by 2045, but it doesn't necessarily mean transportation has to get to zero, because maybe magically some other sectors do below zero, which is technically possible. But when our forests are burning down, I'm not counting on land use change to sequester piles of carbon. And so, I mean, I think we have to look at how transportation can do its share. And I'm not the only one. I mean, basically, that's the idea of the study, that what does it look like for transportation to go towards zero? So UC Davis led the study. We worked with UC Berkeley, UC Irvine, and UCLA, and it was a great collaboration among these campuses, the four campuses that have Institute of Transportation Studies groups. Ours is the biggest, but they're all good. And what we looked at in this study, and kind of the way we approached it a little bit, because this is also sort of how we were asked to think of it, but we know we need to get large reductions in the next 25 years, 24 years, about to be 23 years. Look at reducing VMT, look at fuels. How do we reduce fuel carbon intensity? And look at vehicles. How do we change the kinds of vehicles on the road in large part so that they can use those low carbon fuels, right? So the low carbon possible energy types are electricity, hydrogen, and biofuels, or possibly electrofuels or e-fuels, where you derive, you create a long chain hydrocarbon liquid fuel from carbon capture of some kind and an electric system to build those molecules. It's advanced stuff, but actually that may turn out to be important. We acknowledge that it will be difficult to make huge changes in VMT and vehicle miles of travel. Of course, it's car and light-duty vehicle SUV travel that is the main target here. Maybe we want more bus travel and bike travel and things like that. But so some of it's modal shift. I won't get into it that much today. My main focus is going to be on the vehicles and fuels, and so that may disappoint some people, but maybe we have a little chance to get into it. So the biomass-based liquids is another way of saying biofuels. What's the story there? How much can we rely on them to reduce emissions? And I think fundamentally what a lot of this study became was, how fast can we ramp up the sales of zero emission vehicles, cars, trucks, buses? So that could be electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, and plug-in hybrids. And the faster we do that, the faster we would then turn over the stock and get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles that use these liquid fuels. But even, you'll see that even in the fastest scenarios, there's a lot of internal combustion engines still in play in the 2040s. And if you say we have to be at zero net carbon in the 2040s, you got to do something about that fuel. So I think it's an interesting problem. So let's move on. Now, the state has done a lot already. I mean, arguably among the most ambitious agendas in the world, and targets and policies and all that stuff. And one of the other things we were tasked with doing was to look at this and think about what it could result in, and sort of answer the question, is this enough? Are we going to get there, or do we need other things too, other kinds of policies? Well, the specific targets are certainly ambitious. We already had a 5 million ZEV light duty vehicle target for on-road that the previous governor set a couple years ago, and 5 million by 2030 Jerry Brown would be about, I don't know, a sixth or seventh of the vehicles in the state, right? We have around 35 million vehicles in the state. I can't remember offhand, but it would be pretty good. And 2 years ago, that looked like extremely ambitious, but then by now, then probably not ambitious enough, even though it's not completely clear that we would even be able to get to the 5 million. But the current governor, Gavin Newsom, set a target of 100% ZEV light duty vehicle sales by 2035. So that's in 14 years. And incidentally, that happened last fall, sort of toward later stages of our study, where our base low carbon scenario was to do it by 2040. So he suddenly came out with this executive order, and we were like, oh, okay, well, we got to try even harder. So I'll show you what we did in a minute. And then also 100% of the trucks, so all kinds of different trucks, should be ZEV by 2045, not just sales, but everything. So it was kind of interesting that they used it more on the stock as their target there. They are coming back around to saying that we want 100% of ZEV truck sales to be ZEV by 2040. So that's, I don't think that's official yet, but that's heading in that direction. And then on the fuel side, there's been a mandate to reach 100% renewable energy for electricity by 2045 for some time. That does not exist for transportation, but it's an obvious target for transportation to get to something close to that. It fits with the carbon neutrality goal. So we considered that. Now, some of the actual rules, those are all targets. It's nice to have targets, but there are, well, actually the third bullet there is a rule for electricity. And and ARB is working to implement these things and come up with the rules that make it happen. And some of the things they're doing include those bottom bullets. We have the Advanced Clean Truck Targets, ACT, which basically says that manufacturers of trucks are going to have to sell more and more ZEVs over time to continue to operate in California. I'll show you more about that in a minute. There's also an Advanced Clean Fleet Rule. And I think this is probably the first of the, well, in fact, both of those are probably the first of a kind to regulate trucks like this for ZEVs anywhere in the world. And they have realized that it's not enough to tell the manufacturers that they have to sell these vehicles. They're going to have to tell fleets that they have to buy these vehicles to get it to work, is what they've decided. And again, I'll come back to this, but maybe even those two aren't enough. You're going to have to make it possible and affordable for them to buy them. And then the low carbon fuel standard has been in place for quite a few years, actually, but its target is to reduce the carbon intensity, the kind of well-to-wheel rated carbon intensity of each fuel. They have a system for scoring that the average of all the transportation fuels in the state has to drop by 20% between 2010 and 2030. And we're some of the way on, and I forget the number right now, but maybe it's 8 or 9% of the way toward 20, or percentage points of the 20 percentage points. So we've got a ways to go. But getting to 20% in 2030 is just the beginning, right? We're going to have to, especially if we're trying to get to zero on fuel, so we're going to have to do a lot between 2030 and 2045. So I'll get into that. We did modeling. There were a lot of different models used in this study, and there's no way I have time to get into all that. I'll just mention that, we had a detailed truck model, we had a detailed land use model, we had a jobs model, different campuses were doing different things. We managed to pull it all together into a coherent kind of narrative. And one of the overarching things was to have these broad scenarios that were aligned with the other work. And so my group led that effort, and I'll present some of those scenarios. And we used a basic stock turnover model for California that has cars, trucks, buses, and we can track sales and stocks and look at different technologies coming in and look at efficiency and look at how much they travel and see what it means for CO2. So that's all I'll say on that. But, you know, there are a few students working on those models. So, you know, if you're interested, let me know. We can get more people involved. Okay, just in case my internet breaks, I want to get you the punchline right now, and then get into why this is kind of the result. But the answer is, yeah, we found that you can get to something close to zero CO2 for road transportation in California by 2045, at least on paper. And it's not quite 100%, but it's close enough, as they say, close enough for government work, and still going down by 2050. And it's basically about phasing out the last internal combustion engine vehicles and having zero carbon energy. And both of those, that last 5–10%, it's going to be challenging. I mean, the whole thing's going to be challenging, but the closer you get to 100, I think we're going to discover all kinds of little issues there as we get down this here curve. And so that's something we think about now. I think that the second half of this transition is, you know, it's not like the first half is assured, but the second half is a very interesting, different kind of world that we are only beginning to think about. The fuel mix that gets you there here, and this is called our LC1 scenario, our low carbon one, which is sort of a central low carbon scenario. And it basically gets to where you have no more fossil fuel in the system by 2045. So these lighter blues here are gasoline, the gray is diesel, and the orange and yellow are biofuel. So bio-based gasoline is BBG, and bio-based diesel is biodiesel, BBD. These would, over time, have to change from what they are today. They can't just be corn-based ethanol or soy-based biodiesel or renewable diesel. They're going to have, which are not bad fuels. They give you something like a 30 to 40% reduction on the scoring of well-to-wheel LCA modeling of fuels, and it can vary a lot, and there's a lot of question marks around these LCAs. But in the low carbon fuel standard, they have a methodology for doing it, and we follow those scorings. But they don't even have scorings for some of the advanced kinds of fuels yet that we may need. And I think there are cellulosic ethanol. There's scores for that for certain kinds of pathways. We may need to have cellulose-based drop-in gasoline and diesel fuels in order to be able to produce enough of them and use land that is not competing as much with food production, and also to get a truly very low greenhouse gas kind of fuel. We produce almost none of those kinds of fuels today. Everything we produce comes from either waste streams, which are good, but there's never going to be a lot more of that, or from oils or grain crops. And those are not going to be the long-term solution to a sustainable, very low carbon biofuel system, especially with scale up. And we'll talk about that scale up in a minute. Okay, so that was the kind of punchline, but then of course it starts to get more complicated. I'm going to mention a few other scenarios, and then, you know, look at some of these implications. We'll look at cost, look at a few different metrics for what we think about these scenarios, and then think a little more about policy. So hopefully I can do all that in another half hour or so. This shows that there were actually 3 other scenarios besides this LC1, and that they varied in certain ways. They don't actually, it turns out, we kind of learned it doesn't matter that much for the most part, which one of these you do. They're fairly similar in a lot of ways, but what they are, if you look in the first column and the second column, that's cars and trucks, when you get to 100% zero emission vehicle sales. And as I mentioned, Governor Newsom now says we got to do it by 2035. Well, that's our high ZEV scenario. And actually, ARB is looking at some even more ambitious scenarios that aren't in this study. There's one called high fuel cell, and that's because in our LC1, it's actually dominated by electric vehicles. There aren't a whole lot of fuel cells, so we wanted to do one where we looked at a higher fuel cell kind of market. And then the last one we called high liquid fuel, but it's just another way of saying kind of lower ZEV or slower ZEV, where ZEVs don't get there. You don't get to 100% ZEV till 2045, which is still arguably fairly rapid. 2 years ago, that would have seemed very rapid. I mean, that's one of the interesting things is how fast the landscape is changing to, you know, what was ambitious 2 years ago isn't ambitious anymore, because, you know, the science is evolving, and we're realizing that if we want to have a chance to stay below 2 degrees, you know, global temperature change, we got to do this, you know, mostly by 2050. So we did not vary the VMT, the car driving. In every scenario and I do have one slide on this, we looked at different ways to cut the growth in car travel, or actually it's not really growing at this point, although it's growing right now because it's going back to pre-COVID levels, but that in the long run, it's about cutting it 15% relative to where it was headed. You could do more probably, but at the same time, even 15% might be pretty challenging. Okay, so let's look at cars a little more and then trucks. So the ZEV penetration, as I mentioned, you've got the 3 scenarios, is 2035, 2040, and 2045. And for those who can see this little cursor, that's this orange, blue, and gray here. You can see what year they hit 100%. And then on the right, you can see that in this LC1 scenario, the black line's the overall market share, so it gets to 1 by 2040. And about 2/3, maybe 70% of that is battery electric vehicles. Now, we do live in a state where we sell an awful lot of electric vehicles of a certain brand, and that might have influenced these scenarios somewhat, but they also represent a truly zero emission vehicle if electric is decarbonized, whereas plug-in hybrids don't. And they do seem to be charging ahead, so to speak. So that ended up being sort of through a combination of analysis and judgment where we ended up in terms of these shares. So the orange is plug-in hybrids, and the green is fuel cells. So they never get really above about 12% of the share in that scenario. However, if we look at a couple of other scenarios and look at actual sales of vehicles that are in these figures, you can see that, well, first of all, we pretty much didn't grow things off of, we had enough increase in the BAU. Oh, I didn't mention BAU. So there's a business as usual case, but you can see that in the business as usual case, you still get up to 500,000 per year of battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles by 2030, which isn't that much more than today. And maybe we're going to be on a faster track. I mean, 2021 is looking like a very good year for electric vehicles, so this is not picking that up. But so between 2020 and 2025, we might see higher growth than shown here. But certainly by 2025, we say, okay, it has to take off. And you get to over 1 million vehicles per year sold by 2030, especially if you add these left-hand ones, BEV and plug-in hybrid, with the right-hand figure, which is the fuel cells. It's over 1 million in a market of maybe 2 million. So you're at 50%. And so that's a pretty big challenge. That happens to also be a number that the Biden administration has announced as a target at the US level, that 50% of LDV sales should be ZEV by 2030. It's incredibly ambitious. I think California's got the best shot at it of any state because we're the farthest along at something like, I don't know what we are right now, but I think it's over 10%. The different scenarios are not that different, but yes, the high ZEV, it's happening by 2035, that orange line. If you look at the fuel cells, again, they don't grow anywhere near as fast, but you got to think of the fact that we're talking about a very nascent market here. Battery electrics and plug-in hybrids have been selling for 10 years now, and there's a lot of models available. There's only 3 models available for fuel cells, and we only have about 10,000 on the road in California, whereas we have, I guess we probably have 1 million or more battery electrics and plug-in hybrids on the road. And the sales are a few thousand a year right now. Now that's got to change if this is going to matter, and it could change quickly as we get more models, as we get more stations. We've got about 50 hydrogen refueling stations right now. The target is somewhere between 150 and 200 in about 4 more years. It will begin to be less painful to try to go find fuel for your hydrogen vehicle. And one of our scenarios, the high fuel cell, does take off around 2030, and it goes up to about 600,000 per year by 2045. So in that scenario, it's close to half of the ZEV sales in that year. No, excuse me, it's a third. It's a third of ZEV sales in that year, but it's a very significant market, and we are doing other research now on what it looks like to build a hydrogen system around that kind of scenario, along with trucks and other possible sources of hydrogen demand. So that is in there. On the truck side, speaking of that, here's the situation. You've got these 3 scenarios again. And trucks, it's 2035 in the high ZEV for all the different kinds of trucks, 2040 in LC1, and actually 2050 in the high biofuels. This picture shows long haul, but it's actually maybe a little faster for some of the other ones, but that's pretty ambitious for long haul trucking. And then I won't go through these figures on the right. They're sort of eye charts, but it varies a lot by the kind of truck. These are different kinds of trucks, and it varies both in terms of how fast. For example, I will call out transit buses, which are required to be 100% ZEV sales by 2030, and that happens here. They're mainly battery electric, but there are fuel cell buses as well. The green is fuel cell, and these sort of light blue is battery electric. On the other hand, let's say long haul is still predominantly diesel in 2030. There's about 25% market share of ZEVs. But by 2045, down below, you see it's all fuel cell and battery electric across the board, but with different shares between the 2 of them. So we had some granularity here where we looked at all these different kinds of truck and bus markets, and actually the light duty vehicles are on here as well, and talk about the challenges in these different markets. So with these 4 scenarios now, how are they different in terms of the impact on fuel use when you do all the stock turnover and everything? And I think there's not a lot of difference by 2030, but by 2045, well, even in 2045, it doesn't look like they're that different. And overall, fuel use isn't that different, but the share of liquid fuels versus electricity and hydrogen is quite different. So the blue, I didn't say this in an earlier fuel slide, the dark blue is electricity, the brownish red is hydrogen. And in the high ZEV, when you're transitioning quickly, they are more than half the energy in the transportation system by 2045. But you still do have about 2 billion gallons a year of either biofuel or e-fuel, but of these low carbon liquid fuels. Now, 2 billion gallons is a big number. It's a lot bigger than right now. But I also want to point out that California is just one market. And if the whole world is doing this and does something similar and decides that we're going to decarbonize all the fuel all over the world by, let's say, 2050, and you still have enormous numbers of internal combustion engine cars and trucks on the road around the world, you're putting yourself in a position where you're going to need a lot of this kind of fuel. So the 2 billion gallons for California becomes something like 50 billion gallons for the US, and maybe as high as 80 billion gallons if you include aviation and shipping. And then it goes into the hundreds of billions of gallons if you look worldwide. So suddenly the 2 billion gallons doesn't look so bad, but beware, if not everybody can do this, then should California do it? I think it's a fair question. In this high liquid fuel scenario where we were slower with the ZEV uptake, we actually end up with twice as much liquid fuel, low carbon liquid fuel in 2045. So it does really matter. The speed at which we adopt ZEVs and move toward electricity and hydrogen really makes a big difference in terms of what you would need in terms of liquid fuels if you do that. All right. So now let's think about cost. So there's a lot of different kinds of cost, and there's different ways to measure it, and it's a very complicated topic. And so there are investment costs. What is it going to take? How much infrastructure are we going to have to build? What investments are going to need to be made in new vehicle production and new fuel production? There's also tricks there because some investments would be instead of other investments. If you build a hydrogen refueling station instead of a gasoline station, then you're shifting an investment, and so it's not all incremental. Some of it might be incremental, and we're looking at those kinds of investment numbers. What we did in this study was to just try to kind of keep it simple, but I think it's fairly powerful. It's to look at, from the consumer point of view, what are they spending on new cars, new trucks, and on fuel for those cars and trucks? And with the fuel cost, including the cost of infrastructure and everything else that gets the fuel to the customer, to the pump, or the charger, that affects the price. And so we tried to use prices that reflect that. And what we found, first of all, on the left side, you get that low carbon picture, but I want to focus on the right side. That the yellow line here, the vehicle costs, are higher in our low carbon scenario. So this is the difference between our LC1, our middle low carbon scenario, and a business as usual that has some electric and hydrogen vehicles and some biofuels, but nowhere near as much. It's a relatively, it gets you this blue line on carbon. It's a fairly good reduction, and that is sort of where we're headed. But if you want to do the scenario here that we're talking about, you're going to have to bring in those ZEVs a lot faster, and they're going to be more expensive for a while. The cars and the trucks are more expensive than gasoline and diesel equivalents for a while. Now, at some point, because these technologies are becoming cheaper and we're getting volumes and stuff, they will break even. And this yellow line here breaks even around 2033. So your vehicles actually start to become cheaper at that point. On average, this is an average or a total across cars and trucks, across hydrogen and electric. And if you break it down, you see differences, of course, but that's the average picture. On the energy side, it's even better. You're starting to save money almost right away, because even if electricity is not cheap, which it isn't in California, your electric vehicles, especially your electric vehicles, are so efficient that and this is something we talk about a lot, right? That you're saving money on your electric bill relative to your gasoline diesel bill right away. And that just grows. All these savings grow as you get more and more vehicles out there. And it's just mostly a volume thing that you're building. When you put those two together, of course, for a while, the net cost is higher, this blue line, but eventually you cross zero, and that's around 2030. So for about 10 years, the net expenditure on this system is higher, and then it starts to be lower, and it gets much, much lower. And I think that's a really important finding, that we're essentially investing in a world that would be a cheaper world. Now, it's depending on all the assumptions we make, and you can make other assumptions. And we did do sensitivity analysis to show, with some sets of assumptions, the break-even point isn't until 2035, or maybe it's as soon as 2025, depending on what you assume. But in general, this is a fairly optimistic, happy picture. The total costs under those curves are about 10 billion between now and 2030, which is not chump change. It's a pretty significant amount of money. And the investments may be higher. It's, this is sort of investments and incremental cost minus savings. And but on net, it's a $10 billion increase over the business as usual. And then a cumulative savings for the next 15 years of 175 billion. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so that number is only the vehicles and fuels. There's also the value of the environmental benefits, and there's the carbon benefits, and there's also air quality benefits. And the air quality benefits were one of the things that we spent, I think it was UC Irvine was leading on this, to estimate the value of cutting NOx and PM from cars and trucks over that time frame, and looking at spatially at how it affects sensitive areas in the state, and looking at airshed modeling and stuff like that. Although we didn't do any original airshed modeling for the study, but based on work that's been done and calibrating to the scenario I just showed you, you would save on the order of 28 billion just in 2045. And so I meant to grab the cumulative number, but it's got to be on the order similar to what we've got for the last slide. So it's probably over 100 billion over 25 years. There's also costs or savings associated with CO2, which are in the tens of billions. It depends a lot on how you value the CO2, $50 a ton, $100 a ton. And there are other kinds of costs too. There's land use change related things and whatnot. But in general, the numbers are pretty large on these two. So next point, as I move along here, and let me do a time check. Okay. We looked at workforce, and labor, jobs, workforce impacts is another very complicated topic. I'm not by any means an expert on this one, and I did not lead on this one. This was UCLA led on this one. And they estimated the marginal effects of various aspects of these scenarios on jobs in California. Now, there are other jobs, first of all, within California that could go down, but actually a lot of the effect of this would happen outside the state, and we didn't look outside the state. So you never know what jobs are changing. Let's say if there's a huge reduction in oil use, well, there are places where there's going to be a lot of jobs lost. But that's the sort of the nature of state level or even national level job analysis. You're concerned about what happens in your geographic boundaries, and something different could happen outside of it. But for California, the bottom line is that by 2045, we estimated that there could be 500,000 new jobs from these scenarios. And they come from everything from selling the cars to maintaining the cars to building stations to maintaining stations and whatnot. So that's the basic story there. And it exceeds $20 billion of value in 2045. And so that's the end of the, presenting the scenarios and what they mean. And I do see some questions in the Q&A, but we'll get back to them. But now I'll just spend about 10 minutes on policy. So we can draw these pictures and do this analysis of what these scenarios look like. And I think most people might agree this is pretty critical that we figure out how to do this, but how do we do it? How do we make it happen? And that's where policy comes in. So, I start with just putting that same slide up again, that, yeah, there's a lot going on already. And I think when we did this, we didn't have a final clean truck rule, and we didn't know much about the clean fleet rule yet. Those two should be very, very important in getting to the truck targets. Although even then, we may not make it without some other things. And on the light duty side, we now have the Advanced Clean Car 2 rule being developed. And that's that's going to be developed over the next year or so, and that will set rules for light-duty vehicle ZEV sales to probably to 2035. And it might well mean going to 100% by 2035 or something like that. So there are things happening that are going to be very important to reach these targets. So I think, you know, if you like these targets, that's good news. But we did find that probably you'd better think about some other things too. And probably the most important types of things that could be missing have to do with economics, with making sure, or finances, making sure that the price signals are right, that people can afford to buy the vehicles you're hoping that, or making them buy, that you know, they can get them maintained okay. That's not exactly a price thing, but that, you know, we have an infrastructure for that, that they can charge them or refuel them as needed, when needed, and where needed, which is a very big one. And managing the system. So whether it's an electric vehicle system or a hydrogen system, managing the system so that the energy is where it needs to be, refueling, recharging is there, and in the case of electricity, that we manage the electric system optimally. And you can see one of the bullets here is encourage charging at off-peak times. So in general, managing how we charge our cars within the realm, within the reality of people wanting to be able to charge when they want to charge, that's probably, all those things are important. We always end up saying we need fee baits. So fee baits are fees and rebates. And one of the challenges we've had, I think, politically with things like the California vehicle rebate program is the perception that it's giving money or providing incentives to rich people to buy fancy cars. And so California's already done things about that by putting limits on income levels and vehicle types that you can get those rebates for. It's also, since we might well need incentives for some time, for example, at least until the purchase prices are really comparable with gasoline vehicles, and it's definitely a few more years before we get there. If we have a funding mechanism, it's nice to have an ongoing known funding mechanism for doing this. And one possibility would be to tax gasoline vehicles to raise the money for giving incentives to the ZEVs. And actually, as long as the ZEV shares are not too big, it takes only a small fee on each gasoline vehicle to have a fairly big rebate on a ZEV. And anyway, as far as optics go, if you were taxing the large gas guzzling cars, it might even be a political winner. But and there's been bills like that, but nothing yet that's made it through. These couple of slides are, I'm kind of shamelessly taking from my colleagues at Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Center, and it reminds me I was going to mention this to them, but I forgot. But they're all coming out of, or they're related to this report, and I think they're just really important. And with this group, many people may have seen these already, but this is work by Ken Karani. He's done this over and over again, and it's interviews and surveys with people about their attitudes about electric vehicles and their buying patterns. And what is quite important here is that even though these are three fairly far apart years, the dark blue is 2014, the lightest blue is 2019, things haven't changed that much in a 5-year period when you might have expected the perceptions and the behaviors to have changed a lot. So yeah, more people on this right-hand one, more people have bought a BEV or a PHEV, but fewer people have been gathering information about doing that. And, you know, there's been no real change in people who say, I haven't really thought about it, or at the far left here, I haven't considered it and I don't plan to. It looks like there's 20% of the public that's going to be tough on this. They're just not interested. So if we want to sell 100% ZEVs in 14 years, something's going to have to change here, I think. They also did a nice job for the study looking at how the ramp up of ZEV sales could be thought about in terms of different groups of consumers. So in the left-hand one here, you've got higher income single family, middle income single family, and then people who live in multi-unit dwellings or apartments, and then lower income people. And so, of course, assuming that the highest income are the fastest movers, and they would be 80% of ZEV buyers by 2028 or something like that. Whereas the lower income people, it might, only be 20% by 2035. And I guess this is just new cars, but certainly you would expect this last group to eventually be one of the main buyers of secondhand ZEVs. And that'll be a very important part of this as we start to turn the cars over, and that's happening. The other slide here shows by numbers of household vehicles, and there are people, I've shown this figure to, mostly from Europe, who have a hard time believing there are households with 5 vehicles, but we all know in California it's not that unusual. So yeah, the households with 5 vehicles should be best positioned to have at least one ZEV, and the households that only have one vehicle may have the toughest time because they need that one vehicle to do everything. And also they don't buy as many vehicles. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. And then the last interesting way of looking at it is by charger type and the growth in chargers. And I don't pretend to understand this completely, but basically home level 1 and level 2 have the fastest growth. Level 2 becomes very important by 2030. So home charging continues to be the most important kind of charging that we will have. But eventually workplace charging becomes very important. Although I wonder how COVID affects that kind of thinking with fewer people going to work. But having, especially for longer commuters, having the chance to recharge at work seems very important. Down here, you've got the public ones, and actually I'll call out the public DC fast charging. Very, very important in certain situations, but not necessarily needing to be a huge share of the overall charger landscape. And so if you can have a scenario like this, it's not as expensive as one where you're building just huge numbers of DC fast chargers. Of course, it also depends how much they're getting used and how you're able to amortize the cost over how many vehicles. But anyway, so Plug-in Hybrid Electric Vehicle Center doing really good work on this sort of thing, and I think this is very relevant and important. And let's see. That's about the end of the deep dive. So I'll just talk for a minute about trucks, and then we'll get to some conclusions. So it's not that different from cars. We need to make it possible for fleets to buy these zero emission vehicles. Revenue neutral fee baits are a possibility. There are other things that are actually not really related to incentives, but perhaps a very powerful one is to provide priority lanes or curb access for ZEV trucks. And that'd be very valuable, and to be able to have better locations to do deliveries. Class 2B and 3s, those are your pickup trucks and vans. They're different. A lot of pickup trucks commercial pickup trucks are actually owned by individual tradesmen, and they're not in fleets, and they might buy them a bit more like household consumers buy trucks. But anyway, they're their own kind of thing, and thinking about them, they deserve a special attention, and there are a lot of them. They're the biggest seller of all trucks. And of course, you need to treat construction off-road trucks as, their own thing, and there's lots of different kinds. So we need to make sure that we have enough stations for long haul, or whether it's charging or for fuel cell. We need truck stops with large facilities that can refuel a lot of trucks, and that's going to be a challenge. We need to reform electricity pricing so that depot charging doesn't break the bank, and we also need to make sure that permitting can happen in a timely way. Things are happening so fast now that if it takes 2 years to get from permitting to construction, that's a big problem. Okay, I think I'm going to skip those ones, and I think I've said enough about fuels for the moment. I just sort of feel like turning on the questions, and maybe we can come back to some of these. I'll mention the VMT. The VMT analysis led by UC Berkeley and with UC Davis involvement and other campus involvement, I think it was sort of focused on land use. and how, if we could change how we develop our communities in California, that would be the underpinnings for changing some of the travel patterns. It would make it easier to do transportation demand management strategies. It might, walking and cycling infrastructure become more relevant when there's somewhere to walk and cycle to. Making trips shorter, just right there cuts VMT. So there was a lot on land use, and there was, of course, the what I'll call the standard discussion of pricing. We all agree that road pricing could be important, but we still haven't managed to get to any kind of scalable, like electronic road pricing or other real-time pricing that might have a big impact on travel. But we have a juicy chapter on this in the report. Okay, simple summary. Achieving near zero CO2 transportation by 2045 is going to be extremely challenging, but is possible. And I would say we're off to a good start in California. A combination of strong policies will be needed. We have some of them now. We probably need more. Consumers are going to need to be convinced, and I think this is both households and fleets, and convinced both in terms of understanding what's going on and believing in the technologies, but also that it doesn't break the bank for them. Overall cost benefit for society looks promising, let's say from 2030 onward, if we can get through this investment period and figure out how to pay for it. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Maybe for questions, maybe we can alternate one from the typed in. I'm not sure how many typed in ones you have there.
We have around 10.
10, and then one from the audience who's sitting here. So maybe we start with the first typed in one, and then we'll go to the audience and back and forth.
Okay, so then I just choose the piped in ones,
Yeah.
and people in the room
Can't
see, so I could make something up, I suppose, but of course all the people online would know.
Lou, who's your hairstylist, and why does it look so good?
Let's see. Actually, I would prefer to get one or two from the room while I peruse these.
Okay, sounds good. Let's go here for Hannah first.
So as you mentioned that achieving near zero carbon vehicle will be challenging. So even though we assume that it's realistic, I'm wondering what will happen to all the billions of fossil fuel run vehicles that we are using right now. And, they use internal combustion engine, and as far as I'm concerned, that you can basically convert a vehicle to electric. You basically have to remove the internal combustion engine. So what will happen to them? Are they just waste, or?
It's a great question. I mean, we have this kind of way of thinking of it that we just keep getting all these new vehicles and they're going to work their way through the stock, and then some miracle happens where the stock just disappears. But vehicles can last a long time, right? And a lot of California vehicles end up leaving the state at some point and going to Mexico or going somewhere. Now, a lot stay here forever too. Californians like old vehicles. So these things may stay on the road a long time. And I don't think anyone's done a really good job yet of looking at what might happen in terms of vehicles being sent as secondhand vehicles out of the state. And, globally, at some point, we're going to have to deal with that all these vehicles get shipped to like Africa and South America and stuff. And what do we think about that? And, because they need mobility too, and they're not as wealthy. So it's a complicated topic, but at least in California, either you just let that happen and sort of don't worry about it, or I guess you can do accelerated scrappage. You can actually take old vehicles off the road, and these kinds of programs have been done before, and you pay households to hand in their vehicle. They're typically not that cost effective because a lot of times it's a vehicle that was right on the edge of dying anyway. Those are the ones that people are willing to sell. But yeah, it could be, if things get serious enough, it could be that we'd try that sort of thing.
That Mexico doubles the price of used cars to protect the home market. there's a double tariff on used cars. And cash for clunkers was done in Obama to try and get the auto industry back on board.
That's right. That's right. They've done it in Europe quite a bit. Well, maybe I'll do one here. There are a couple about biofuels. And so what are bio-based fuels made from? There's one, can biomass fuels be made from algae? And there might be another, but I think, so biofuels is a complicated topic. And I don't know if Colin is around, but Colin and Julie Whitcover are really experts on that topic. I'm a kind of pseudo expert, but to make these kinds of advanced biofuels that have better sustainable characteristics, you're probably going to have to start. It could be algae. It could be waste streams, like actually maybe forestry waste products could become an important feedstock to make biofuels from. And then it would ultimately have to be crops, dedicated crops. And then, as I said, you'd like to use cellulosic crops. That means things like grasses or trees, partly because of the kind of land they're on. They're not usually they're not competing with food, but also they can be relatively low CO2 to produce, and they're storing CO2 in the ground. So they're pretty good from that point of view. The problem with almost every one of these things is there are two problems. One is cost. The costs tend to be high compared to using grains or plant oils. The second is scale up. Can we, really get a lot of biofuels from these? We're really good at scaling up crop, production and going to more and more oil. A good example, is the fact that right now, soy oil to a bio-based diesel or renewable diesel in California is rising pretty rapidly. And we've got 2 refiners that are committed to converting their oil refineries to produce that renewable diesel. And they're probably going to use those kind of crop oils because they're the cheapest. And if that happened all over the world, eventually, people are going to be using palm oil, or they're going to replace soy oil with palm oil in other markets, and you get these knock-on effects. Well, palm oil, there are many cases where palm oil is threatening rainforests. So that's the kind of thing that's bad. So we have to figure out how to choose these other options. But again, scale up and cost are going to be the problem. Okay, back to the room.
I had a question about if the scenarios you checked included the emissions and costs of the whole life cycle of batteries and EVs into the problem. So like from where the batteries are produced until they are retaken
End of life of the battery vehicles. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wish I had a chance to better check who's on the Zoom, because there could be ringers out there. But so like Alyssa Kendall is really our expert on this one, but and John for that matter. I certainly am using costs, or we in this study were using cost estimates for batteries that take into account everything that's involved in getting to a battery that is then used in a vehicle, including even the job that the OEMs have, the manufacturers have to build that vehicle and integrate that battery. Does it properly account for all environmental costs of producing a battery? Definitely not. And we know there are some scandalous things going on out there, right? There's the blood cobalt kind of thing where people are using child labor to mine cobalt in some places. So there are some issues. There's also, significant CO2 emissions from mining and from producing those batteries. And I just happen to be going through some studies this morning with Maha, who you probably mostly know her, working on a study with me, and we're comparing studies on what seems to be the situation with the extra CO2 from batteries affecting the overall, carbon intensity of electric vehicles. And it's probably 50 or 60% higher carbon CO2 through materials, through production of the vehicle for an electric vehicle than for a gasoline vehicle right now. That's still a relatively small number compared to its lifetime emissions, but it isn't insignificant. It's not enough by our numbers to negate the overall carbon benefits of electric vehicles. But I think what we all have to do is also try our best to look into the future and see how are these things going to change. And it is true that battery technologies are changing very rapidly. And one of the strong incentives that, believe it or not, that manufacturers have is to get to lower carbon systems because they know everybody's watching. And it also tends to correlate with cheaper systems. If you can, have a less energy intensive process to get a material, that's also a less carbon intensive process and may be cheaper. So I think, and there's some evidence that we've got a trend here where batteries will become less carbon intensive over time. And, we know that we have to decarbonize mining and steel production and concrete production, things like that. And in fact, John and I were talking about, well, he was telling me things. It was very helpful. He was showing me numbers about building roads. So this is another thing that is carbon intensive. And in these scenarios, especially when you do global scenarios and there's a huge amount of growth in travel, in car travel, there's an enormous number of kilometers of roads that are going to get built, that have already been built, and even more are going to get built. So what's the carbon intensity of that? And there is reason to believe that there will be decarbonization as we go forward, but it's very hard to predict the rate or exactly how that's going to play out.
I think just a follow-up question on that. Alyssa's conclusion when I talked to her is that overall, the battery electric still quite a bit less over the life cycle, as Lou said, because of the fuel. Any comment or any insight, Lou, on policies to get the battery manufacturers or the vehicle manufacturers to take responsibility for the batteries at the end of life and incentivize them to come up with the recovery strategies? Any thoughts or anything on that?
Yeah, end of life is another one that's tough. And also, Alyssa, I wish she was here, I'd just tell her to answer, but and we had Hanjiro Ambrose, was a PhD student who really became a very strong expert on this. And then he, of course, graduated, which is one problem we have at this university. We train people, they become really good at stuff, and then they graduate and leave. But
we're not going to raise
what I've learned,
either, by the way.
What I've learned from them and some of the papers is that we don't know much yet about where this is going to go in terms of end of life for electric vehicles, and in what way will we recover the batteries and the materials. And depending, for example, on the battery chemistry, recycling could be easier or harder. We may have a problem with recycling that every manufacturer uses a different chemistry. And so then what do? You can't have standardized processes for taking everything apart and reusing. And not only that, I guess on the good news side of it is these batteries, unless they're really pretty far gone, might be useful in second life applications. For example, maybe in mini grids off the big grids in small towns in Africa or something like that. If a lot of electric vehicles end up in Africa, you can bet they're going to figure out a way to use those batteries. So I think we don't really know yet, and it's likely that we're going to use all those precious metals one way or another. The question is whether it will be, how energy intensive it will be, I think.
So I actually have a quick follow-up question to sort of the biofuels topic you were talking about earlier. And I feel like this is like one more challenge that's maybe a little bit closer to home than those other ones, which is in order to grow crops, you need a lot of water, and it feels like we are perpetually in drought. So I wasn't sure if that was a concern you looked at, or if it's not as big as I'm worried it is, or if you can comment at all about sort of the water use aspect of the liquid fuels scenario.
Well, it's raining now, so water problems.
Oh yes, problem.
Actually, in a way.
It did, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think building a crop type biofuel strategy in the state of California is probably problematic. and I don't know if Steve Kafka might be on the call today, but he might disagree with me. I mean, there are going to be certain opportunities, and there could be low water type crops that could be grown with a bioenergy perspective. And it doesn't have to all be for biofuels for transportation, right? It could be bioenergy to burn in power plants or to produce hydrogen with. We're going to need, it looks like we might need a lot of hydrogen. So if you're clever and careful, you can produce these things with crops without as much, the crops we do grow in the state, a lot of them are very water intensive. So, but that's also on very valuable, high producing land. We're probably not going to shift that to producing energy crops. A lot of our biofuels are going to come from outside the state in all likelihood. So this 2 to 3 billion gallons that maybe we would need, a lot of that would probably come from the plains. And, California, what else can we do? We've got a lot of forestry waste that right now burns. And I think there's a lot of action. I'm not involved, but there's a lot of action right now in California to figure out how we can reduce forest fire threat through removal. And then what do you do with that biomass, which normally or previously, when you looked at the cost to produce energy from wood waste kind of biomass, it's pretty high because it's so expensive to collect it and then move it and then create the facilities to process it that it never looked good. But if you're avoiding millions of dollars in fire related costs, maybe it starts to look good. So that's one other possibility. I think we're going to hear a lot about that in the next couple of years.
And forests don't require irrigation.
Yeah, sure.
So decentralization is one of the things also being looked at for materials production to replace some of the road building materials as well. Other questions from the audience?
Oh, yeah, I can,
On the screen? Yeah.
let's see. Oh, well, there was one here about, and I don't know the answer to this, but it was how do PG&E's public safety power shutoffs along with evacuations due to fire, floods, et cetera, impact people's willingness to depend on electric vehicles? I mean, that's an interesting question. That's another angle to the fires. And I don't know the answer in terms of that, but
in transit agencies, it's extremely front of mind, and every transit agency I've talked to has expressed extreme concern over exactly that.
Rural people also.
Yeah.
sure. Well, I mean, we're a fairly electricity dependent society. I mean, are we going to stop having electric lighting because of the possibility of electric cutoffs? I'm not sure what makes electric vehicles different as something to avoid because of the possibility of blackouts. I mean, at least with electric vehicles, you can charge them over a period of time each day. And, if there's a 1 hour blackout, it's probably not going to ruin things. It could. And of course, mobility is critical for people. It might be much worse to not be able to go somewhere for an hour than to sit in your house without power for an hour. And the most important thing, it's not whether or not it's bad or how bad it is, but it is perception. And if the public thinks that it's too risky to depend on electricity for their vehicles, that's going to be a problem for this transition. I guess plug-in hybrids become more interesting because they can run on either, liquid fuel or electricity. I own one. I kind of like that about it. It gives you some resilience. Yeah, I mean, energy storage. We're going to have to solve this in the bigger picture. We're going to need energy storage systems. We're going to need things where we don't have blackouts anymore. We're going to, we just got to work our way through this so we get back to a high reliability electric system, I think is the bottom line.
I think, Lou, it's Gil here. That's a kind of a great question to talk about the 0 to 50 versus 50 to 100. This is exactly the kind of problem that if we need to go, Lou was showing the 5 cars household. Yeah, this is what we used to call plug-in hybrid household. They can have 1 car electric too. Can they have all cars full electric? Can we get everyone to drive only electric? Then these kind of questions we have a lot of uncertainty. The level of uncertainty, the questions is very different.
Yeah. there's no shortage of uncertainty, but you know, we got to do this.
Other questions in the back?
I have a question regarding the energy infrastructure. Can you hear me?
I can't, but Luke may be able to.
You can repeat it.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, put them, yeah.
Keep coming to the
The
microphone.
microphone up here.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go
Just
ahead.
fine. You
Yeah,
can
we'll
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay. So I have a question regarding the energy infrastructures. So if the EV penetration gets very high, that puts the charging needs puts a lot of a huge challenge on the energy infrastructures. Do you have any insights about how this would be addressed?
So you're asking just about whether if there were large numbers of vehicles charging, what kind of stresses that puts on the electric system?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it could for sure, and we most likely are going to need to add capacity to our generation systems to provide enough power. If if we get to these numbers where we have a lot of electric vehicles running around, but the better we manage that system, the better it's going to be. I mean, I think there's a nightmare scenario where it's a relatively unmanaged system and you've got all these peak moments that are very expensive. You've got times when you're curtailing wind and solar power because there's not enough demand and all kinds of things like that. But in a well-managed system, we might find that things work well. There's a lot of energy storage and the price of electricity, isn't too bad. It might even come down because you're utilizing the system better. Because we have a lot of peaks right now and troughs in our daily load curves that if you could get rid of those, that's good for everybody. So it depends, but I think there's a chance to do it right.
Actually, I have another question regarding the renewable energy. So actually, it's a question probably from Dr. James Bushnell. I recently read a paper by him. A question about the regulation of the clean energy. So, yeah. I forgot the question. Maybe I should write to you. I'm sorry.
I didn't really hear it.
Question got forgotten.
Yeah.
He's probably gonna send you an email with it.
Okay. So there's one here that I think is fine. That's, do you think fee baits are regressive in a way since mostly high income people are buying electric vehicles, so you'd be taxing lower income? Although actually, I think I kind of talked about this already, but you do need some kind of guardrails on that. You don't want to be giving $10,000 to a millionaire to buy Teslas or something or whatever it is they're buying. So you want to have some limits on who gets that kind of incentive money or the kinds of cars that they're targeted to. And I think we know how to do that. Although it's interesting, it seems to be difficult to create a bill in the assembly and the legislature that really does a nice job of handling those kinds of equity issues on a fee-based style of program. And it also is very difficult, I think, to come up with one that will get public support because people will really notice the fee part and not so many people will care about the rebate part.
Go ahead.
Professor, thank you for the great talk. I believe a study from MIT said that the transmission lines in the US are enough for 150 million cars right now, which is more than half. And there's 256 million cars in the US. So that might not be a short-term problem, which is, I have two questions. One is on FEVs, fuel cell, hydrogen. How much of it right now is it clean, like renewable energy through electrolysis versus fuel like hydrogen from oil or coal, which is just or nuclear. And the second is, do you see or do you know anybody working on refurbishing these cars for, let's say, developing countries? That you take all this internal combustion engines and you make them electric or hybrid and export. Kind of jumping off from the great question on the waste.
So let's see. If I can remember all three of those, I wanted to reply to the first comment that, and Alan Jen is, I think, our resident expert on transmission. And I think there could be a challenge with transmission lines in the country. And that's, I think, part of some of the investment in the Biden plan is to upgrade all the transmission lines. California, in Alan's runs that I'm aware of that he's done for a project I'm doing, it doesn't look that bad in the West. He seems to think that we could move the electrons around okay on a fairly ambitious electric scenario. But I think maybe, I don't know, I think maybe that's still an open question we need to look at some more. Fuel cells currently have to use hydrogen that is at least 1/3 renewable in the state. That's the rule. So what you've got is basically almost all the hydrogen comes from steam methane reforming of gas, of methane. 1/3 of it is renewable natural gas, and 2/3 of it is regular fossil natural gas. All of it creates CO2 when you do that process. And there's probably not enough renewable natural gas to scale up with, because we've already used all our renewable natural gas 5 times over with all the different plans we have for it. So really, you're going to either have to have whatever the natural gas is with carbon capture and storage. There will be some opportunities for that, but most of the people who are looking at this closely figure it's going to have to be electrolysis. So you're going to have to make your hydrogen from electricity. It's more expensive, although costs are coming down for electrolyzers. If you build many, many electrolyzers, the costs will come down. If you build large ones, so all that scale stuff is yet to be, exploited. And there's a general sense that there's a chance we could have affordable electrolytic hydrogen in the next 5 to 10 years. And then just like for electric cars, you got to have clean electricity. So that's where I think where the state's trying to go. Oh, and then the third one was about retrofitting cars. Yeah, I think Gil and I have had a tiny little conversation about this, and I think that for the most part, it's not likely. It's just too expensive to take an old car and put in a completely new drivetrain. But I kind of think that maybe for vintage cars, at least I think it could be a very interesting strategy for getting segments of the public to think that electric cars are cool. If you had a certain number of these hot rod old cars converted to electricity, because they're going to be even faster. And
you can convert your old Porsche to a Tesla.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you want to spend $80,000 on a Volkswagen Beetle.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think there's a part to play there. Yep.
I had an equity question. So it looked like, if I got that right, the extra cost of the vehicle purchases in the next 10 years was $10 billion. Was that 10 billion total or 10 billion per year at the peak?
Total. That's total. Sorry. Yeah. 1 billion per year, although it peaks out at about 2.5 or something like that.
So we're spending 2 billion a year on forest firefighting extra. The state budget is 220 billion, and we have a $40 billion surplus this year. The scaling. And in terms of the equity, doing rebates, which have benefited richer people by far. And also then the added just comforts of life of getting to use that commuter lane with the stickers, and everything's benefited the wealthy or the near wealthy.
Yeah.
Any appetite for just going out and subsidizing to less than gasoline for poor and lower middle class people? It looks like the money's there. I mean, you could just get a giant jump start on that, couldn't you?
I think.
And sorry, the second part to that is
okay.
Clearly from the second part is I got the car, how do I get it charged? In addition, the cost of retrofitting your house to get a faster charger so it doesn't take 12, 14, 18 hours to charge a vehicle, probably about $6,000 to $10,000 also, right? So that would be the second part, is the charging and subsidizing that.
Well, I mean, I think a level 2 charger might not be that much, but I'll leave that one to Gil. But I think the societal cost of this is a very tricky topic because, like, the numbers I showed suggest that it's worth doing, definitely worth doing. The benefits far exceed the costs over time. But the actual incremental investments that someone has to make is the hard part. And you know, we do need to have business models where, let's say, if we're expecting a lot of private money to come in and build charging stations, that they can get a return on that investment. Or if you're going to build a hydrogen refueling station, that you get some customers and you get your money back. If the state were willing to pay for everything, I think probably it's going to be more than 10, because 10 is already after we've subtracted out the fuel savings. But you could tax the fuel somewhat to pay for it, but we have lots of other ways of raising revenue.
That's a little
But-
regressive unless you're.
That's a little regressive.
Yeah.
And we don't want to tax electricity too much, because that's part of the point, is to get people to use electric vehicles. But I do think the state could do this. I think actually the state could be, you know, and they're putting a lot of money into this, but they probably could almost pay for everything, especially with the economy the way it is right now. A year ago, it looked terrible. It looked like we were going to have huge deficits, but now there's huge surpluses. So it's a good moment to think big. And, you know, so I go for that. There's also the fact that these things are risky. And so whoever's putting out this money is at risk of not getting that return. I think especially hydrogen, probably. It takes a huge upfront investment to build that system. And it's like Field of Dreams, you know, if you build it, will they come? We don't really know, but we're trying, but we're taking kind of baby steps in that direction. But if you just did the moonshot and spent 100 billion in 15 years on a hydrogen world, and if it works out, you're going to get it all back, right? And that's why the incremental cost isn't so bad. But to get somebody to commit to that, it almost has to be the government, because private sector is going to be too careful to do that.
Is that a question or a stretch?
Oh, I should check for these Q&A ones here. Let's see. So one
I think this is
is
the
to,
last one, Lou.
what's that?
One or two more, then we gotta let.
Oh yeah, we're at time. I'm sorry. Okay, last one. This is a good last one. What are some of the key unknowns, known unknowns, that could change what the road to zero transportation would look like? And I like that one because that's a Rumsfeld quote, right? There's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And it turned out there were unknown unknowns that made invading Iraq a very bad idea. So we know that a bunch of stuff I just said, that there's a lot of uncertainty to the investments, and there's also a lot of uncertainty to how consumers are going to behave, both fleets and households. There's some uncertainty about costs, but maybe that's not too bad. Maybe we can tolerate the amount of uncertainty we have about different kinds of costs. Although one of the big ones actually is what happens to oil prices, because they just jump all over the place, and it's very hard to gauge what a medium-term trajectory on oil prices is going to be. And that really matters in terms of whether or not everything else looks cheaper or more expensive. And then from the point of view of California, there's some political uncertainty here, but actually it's pretty clear that this state is very committed to doing this. And I think investors probably have some sense of feeling like, okay, you know, I can invest here because they're not going to pull the rug out from under me. But nationally, there's no certainty at all. And things can go back and forth every 2 years. And I think that is a huge uncertainty for the country to move forward. So that's the end.
All right. Great talk, great questions, and we'll see everybody next week.